It's good to see everybody here tonight. Thank you so much for coming and being a part of our lecture series. And happy Victory over Japan Day. It's August 14th. The road to victory over Japan was very long and very bloody. And the atomic bombs, I think, played an important part in ending that conflict. And we're going to hear about Deak Parsons, who played a very important role in the success of those missions at the end of World War II in just a moment. I get to be the laboratory historian today because Roger Meade hired me a decade ago. So you have him to blame. It truly is an honor to be able to introduce Roger tonight. He served as the laboratory's archivist historian for 25 years. And he retired in 2007. He's the co-author of Critical Assembly, which is the technical history of the wartime years here in Los Alamos. If you don't have a copy of Critical Assembly in your library, you're missing out. It's a phenomenal history written straight from the documentary basis, which is in the laboratory archives, which Roger did so much to maintain during his career at the laboratory. He's currently working on a book-length study of atmospheric weapon testing in the Marshall Islands, so we'll have that to look forward to one of these years before long, I hope. That'll be coming up. And he's currently working as a contract historian for LANL's radiochemistry group. He conducts research on the technical aspects of both foreign and domestic nuclear tests. So he's still a historian here at the laboratory. In fact, we've called him the emeritus historian, the contract historian, all this. To me, and I think to many of you, he will always be the historian of Los Alamos National Laboratory. And in addition to being a phenomenal historian, Roger Meade he's been a wonderful friend and mentor to me. And so, again, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce my good friend and a friend to our community and the laboratory, Roger Meade.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Alan, for that introduction. It is a bit disconcerting, however, to be here tonight. For many years, while I was a historian, I would creep up behind people, tap them on the shoulder, and find a polite way of saying, you're kind of old and gray. Would you mind giving a history talk? I got that tap for this talk, and it is a bit disconcerting to know you've reached the stage in your life that you never thought you'd get to. There we do. World War II made many people famous. Some of them very famous, and three of those very famous people you see here. Probably what you might not recognize or appreciate is that before the war, they were really unknowns. Eisenhower was very unknown, except in the Army, and it was not until after the invasion of North Africa in November of 1943 that the press could even spell his name right. Oppenheimer in the middle needs no introduction for this crowd, but he too was unknown before the war, but comes out very, very famous. And of course, the man on the right is Admiral Chester Nimitz, who led the Pacific Fleet in defeating Japan. And coincidentally, he was probably the most famous before the war. He actually led one of the first successful rescues of downed submariners in the early 20s. He was a submariner. And so he did get some press, but he too was really relatively unknown before World War II. Now, when you travel through Espanola, New Mexico, you will pass this road sign. It's kind of bent, it's gnarly. I doubt you've even taken notice of it. And if you even read it by chance, I don't know if you know what it's for. But it's for this man here. It's Major General Charles Cowboy Pete Corlett. Corlett was in the Army. He was a few years older than Eisenhower. His career mirrored Eisenhower. He did many things that Eisenhower did through his career. And unlike Eisenhower, Corlett actually went to combat in World War I and was wounded. At the beginning of World War II, he's promoted to Major General. Nimitz hires him to lead a task force, and he goes north to Alaska and leads the invasion of Kiska, the island, which was the only United States soil that Japan occupied during World War II. He then goes to the South Pacific, to the Marshall Islands, and leads the invasion of Kwajalein. After the war, when all was said and done and people were looking at the various invasions, the Kwajalein one under Corlett was deemed the best executed of all amphibious assault invasions during World War II. For his reward, he's not promoted to Lieutenant General, but he's sent to Europe to help Eisenhower plan for D-Day. He was the only Army general at this time that had any combat assault experience. He was writing a manual on it. He could go toe-to-toe with Marine generals on any assault tactics you wanted. He goes to the ETO, and he's unwelcome. He gets a combat command, but he's not one of Eisenhower's boys. He didn't go to North Africa. He really is unwanted, and so he's shut out of invasion planning. He does, however, take his 19th Corps into Normandy 4 days after D-Day and leads them against the bulk of the German army. You can see here his combat corps shot down 55 aircraft, captured almost 30,000 German troops, built 160 bridges, and crossed 5 major rivers. Corlett falls ill, and Eisenhower fires him, doesn't like him, sends him home. And he goes on, and he's going to go back to the Pacific. Nimitz rehires him, but before he can go back to war again, the war ends. And so his career ends, and he retires to Espanola, New Mexico. Now, the reason he comes to Espanola is that his first wife, who died tragically, was the daughter of Frank Bond. Corlett grew up in Monte Vista, Colorado, and actually herded cattle from Monte Vista down to Espanola, met the daughter of Bond, fell in love. They were eventually married. So he retires there with his second wife. You can see he served on the board of trustees of the Espanola Hospital, helped organize the first Oñate Festival, sat on the New Mexico Investment Council, and others. But this is his reward for his service to the nation, is this old bent street sign that's in Espanola. And I bring that up because if you go to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, you see a very similar situation. Sign's a bit bigger, but the overall story is going to be about the same, and it's for this man, William Sterling Deak Parsons. Parsons is born in 1901. He graduates from Fort Sumner High School in 1918. He's somewhat of a prodigy. He's really a math prodigy and a whiz. At age 16, he competes for an appointment to the Naval Academy and beats out everybody else. So he goes to the Naval Academy at age 16 and graduates in 1922. And it's at the Academy that he gets his nickname Deak, which is a play on his last name Parsons. It was originally Deacon Parsons, but got shortened to Deak. He goes to sea on the battleship Idaho, and here you see the ship, and he commands, he commands, is the pointer working? Can't see. He commands one of the 14-inch gun turrets. Actually, the top 3-gun turret is his turret. He commands that. And while on the Idaho, he sits down at night with paper and pencil and recalculates all the firing parameters for these big guns, and the Idaho becomes the best shooting ship in the Navy. Now, the Idaho had one great feature to it. It had one freshwater toilet. Don't give the secret away. It has one freshwater toilet, and even though Parsons is an officer, he's not allowed to use this toilet. So if you want to ask the question later, we can see if we can figure out where this one freshwater toilet was on this ship. He goes to the Naval Postgraduate School. He really is an engineering whiz. He's assigned to the Naval Proving Ground. So you see one of the big guns that he actually worked on and the thing at the Proving Ground. But it's here that he becomes a career engineering manager, a project manager. He doesn't do science. He doesn't invent things, but he makes things work. He takes over projects, and it's here that he takes on a radar project and the proximity fuse project. And he engineers those into combat useful items for the Navy and for the Army. So at the beginning of World War II, you can kind of see the great strategic problem that faces the United States. The red line represents loosely what the Japanese called their Z line. It's where they wanted their forces to have access and to control. They would give the United States everything to the right of this line. They would control everything to the left. And you see Midway and Hawaiian Islands are there and some of that. But the Japanese hoped that they could make war so costly to prosecute by holding that line that the United States would back off and not really commit to total war for them. And of course, the United States couldn't accept what essentially would make the Pacific a Japanese lake. This is the tactical problem that we faced at the beginning of World War II, and this is just fast attack aircraft. So you can see somebody trying to shoot down the aircraft on the left, and by most counts, it took an average of 4,000 rounds to shoot down one plane. And you really couldn't do it. In fact, it never really was satisfactorily solved during the war. But you see what happens when you have a kamikaze attacking the ship on the top right, and of course on the bottom you see that. So very, very difficult to do. And part of the answer to solving that problem was the proximity fuse. And again, Parsons did not invent this, but at the Naval Proving Ground, they were testing this out. They thought at first that they could shoot ships with these things, but Parsons realized that you could shoot on airplanes. So it's basically marrying radar to an artillery shell, firing it at a plane, and when the radar senses the plane, it blows up. Parsons goes to combat in December 1942 with this weapon on the USS, I forget what the ship name is, it is the Helena, and they mount him on these 5-inch gun turrets. They actually shoot him out of these 5-inch gun turrets. He goes to battle later that month, and the first trip out, they shoot down 5 of 7 planes with these radar shells, and they go into production. So this helps solve part of the tactical problem. And so Parsons does a great favor for the Navy because you realize war in the Pacific was really about aircraft against ships, and so it was very, very important to do that. But it had a wider implication. Now, the proximity fuse was the first great technical secret of World War II. The shells were not allowed to use to be over land. They didn't want any duds to be recovered and reverse engineered. So you could shoot them over water, but you couldn't shoot them over land. But all of a sudden in Europe, the war goes badly. On the top right-hand picture, that's what's left of the Hurtgen Forest. It was a great tactical defeat for the United States Army. They lost over 33,000 troops in the shell tank there. And then you have the Battle of the Bulge. And so the shells were released for activity first against the V-1 rockets over England, but they were given to General Patton during the Battle of the Bulge, and you can see what Patton thinks of the shell here. And I think the story is that a little-known Navy captain who doesn't invent things, who's very unassuming, makes a great contribution, not only war in the Pacific, but war in Europe as well. So this was the problem facing Los Alamos in June 1942. So fission's been discovered. We see what chain reaction is on the right. The end product, of course, on the left. The end product, of course, is on the right. And it's a translation problem. How do you get from left to right? Oppenheimer didn't know. Beta didn't know. These guys knew physics. They knew fission would work. They knew roughly how you might make a bomb, but they didn't know how to build a bomb. So they didn't know how to get from the left to the right. And so Groves goes searching for somebody who can answer that translation problem, who can help it. And so here's a quote that Groves wrote to Parsons after the war, saying, "This is how we selected you to come to Los Alamos." Now you might think after saying all that, when Parsons got here, he'd start working on Little Boy and Fat Man. We've got to get these bombs built. His first order of business, his first memo is about roads. You see on the top left, we had very bad roads even after Los Alamos was in operation in early June 1943. So Parsons writes to Oppenheimer saying, "You got to go to Groves, we've got to fix the roads." Groves did not want to fix the roads. He thought they were a security feature. He thought if we had bad roads, you wouldn't get tourists. There were, in fact, a few, and you wouldn't get people coming up. So if you had bad roads, you could protect yourself. So Parsons took on Groves first to get rid of the old roads and put new roads in. The second thing he did was to work on housing. You can see in the top right some of the early housing. So Parsons, one of the first things he did again after the roads was say, you know what, it's just important how people live as what they do. And so he worked to really build Los Alamos into a livable community. And so he actually drew up floor plans for new apartments. He did battle with the University of California and unfortunately lost about revamping the Sunt apartments in particular and some others, but he really wanted to improve housing. And the third thing he did is he hired a kindergarten teacher. He really was worried about the schools. He had 2 young daughters here. So he and Martha, his wife, recruited the first kindergarten teacher, and Parsons himself served on the school board while he was here at Los Alamos. But then he finally got around to building bombs. So this is the Ordnance Division in June of 1943, and you can see the group designations on the left, group headings in the middle, and the group leaders on the right. And you can see that on that list of group leaders, there are 2 future Nobel laureates who not only worked for Parsons, but thought he was the best boss they ever had. Ian McMillan won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1951, and Norman Ramsey for Physics in 1989. But to a man, these group leaders thought Parsons was the best thing that happened to Los Alamos, and we're not shy about saying so. And then this is the translation problem. How do you build Fat Man in this case? And so on the left, you have one of the early implosion experiments where they're trying to symmetrically crush pipe, sewer pipe in this case. And then on the right, you see from the museum what the ultimate bombs look like. So it was getting, again, from the left hand to the right hand, and this was Parsons' job. And of course, there were many iterations of these bombs. This was taken at Wendover Field in Utah. You can see some of these Little Boy models in the front. They're more called sewer pipe or thin man bombs. They were actually meant for plutonium, not uranium. But still, and there are a couple of Fat Man shapes in there.
Sure, Steve.
Thank you.
It's not
Okay.
a point, it's not a point right now.
Okay. Now I got two devices to. So again, these are the sewer pipe bombs right here. Here's a fat man here and a couple fat men back there. So again, it was an iterative process. You just didn't build Little Boy and Fat Man. You had to go through this whole painful process, and this is what Parsons was facilitating. And this is taken out at gun site TA6. And I put it up here because this is what building guns is all about. It's not scientists in lab coats thinking fission and how you do this and do that and the physics packages we hear so much about today. It's men with spud bars and in chains and hoists and everything trying to move all this stuff around. So in this case, you had to take a gun, put several kilograms of uranium in it, fire it, and have it go off. So it's got to contain pounds and pounds of high explosives or gunpowder. It's got to contain all the uranium, and it's got to work. But it was nasty, dirty work. And Oppenheimer didn't understand that, nor did anybody else. And it was really Parsons who did this for the laboratory. And this is one of the early Little Boy models being worked on. And it's part of an early form of flight testing. And I'll show you another slide here in a minute. And I show you this because, again, this doesn't look anything like Little Boy. And pay attention to these tails here. It was a problem that was never, ever solved during the war, and that was the aerodynamics of bombs. How do you make them fall? A lot of them went ass over tea kettle when they came out of planes. Some of the fat men would actually tumble end over end. Never solved. One specialty that we never had during the lab during the war was an aeronautical engineer. Nobody ever thought to hire one. Hence, these bombs were aeronautical nightmares. And here's one. They hoisted them up on cables. Again, at Wendover, but they had big cranes. They'd hoist these up on cables. They would check antennas and fuses and things like that. But absent B-29s, which were still not available to them, they had to do some flight testing. And so they rigged up these cable systems to hoist these things, in some cases several hundred feet in the air, to test them. And here's a fat man being worked on. Now, one of the things in the middle of this that Parsons did that really makes a difference to Los Alamos is that he hires Norris Bradbury. Bradbury comes in to take over some of the fat man work, and so you see Norris sitting here at the top of Trinity Tower. But as many of you know, after the war, there was some concern the laboratory might not survive. In fact, Oppenheimer writes to Groves in November saying, "I find the conviction growing that Los Alamos is headed for dissolution." So a lot of my colleagues have written that while Oppenheimer was the creator laboratory, Norris was its salvation or savior. And if that's true, and I sort of think it is, then I think we owe it to Parsons and maybe by extension Groves for the decisions they made in hiring, whether it was by serendipity or whatever. But the reason we're here today in a building called the Bradbury is really because of Parsons and who he hired in 1944. And I throw this up here because he also was the chief naval officer at the laboratory, and he was answerable to Groves. So here's Groves complaining about the poor military dress of both the Navy and the Army people here. But in typical Parsons fashion, this is kind of how he dealt with it. You see, he just says, action taken in a meeting of naval officers. You know, Parsons never got real upset with the silliness that we see today of the military and some of Groves' penchant for spit and polish. He would take it in stride, he would blunt the object, and he would move on. But very typical Parsons to do that. The other thing Parsons did that really wasn't related to Fat Man and Little Boy particularly was he was sent to Port Chicago, California in 1944. Port Chicago is kind of north and east of San Francisco. It's on an arm of San Francisco Bay. So 2 ammunition ships blew up, basically destroyed the docking facilities, the whole town of Port Chicago, and killed about 300 black enlisted stevedores. Parsons went there in part to see what an atomic bomb might look at. He thought this might be something that they could look at the effects of what bomb damage might look at. In addition to Port Chicago here, they also looked at the Halifax explosion of ammunition ships that happened in 1917 and actually had documents sent in on the Great Siberian Meteor. They were looking for ways to see what effects might be. The trip didn't really help them much. The devastation was pretty complete. They calculated the damage radius and that sort of thing, but it really didn't help them. It was even by atomic bomb standards, it was still pretty small. The sad thing about Port Chicago is the white officers ordered the surviving black sailors to go back loading ammunition ships, and the black sailors mutinied, or refused to work, they were brought up on mutiny charges and sent to prison for the duration of the war. And for a short time after, there's been an act in Congress to have the mutiny court-martial overturned, but it hasn't happened yet. So it's kind of a sad chapter in our history as well. This was taken out of V-sights, so if you're going to put a bomb in an airplane, that airplane's going to go up the B-29s to about 30,000 feet. They shake, rattle, roll. It gets very cold below zero. So here you see a bomb bay mocked up. It's for a vibration test and kind of a mock-up Fat Man. So Parsons controlled this work, authorized it, and got the parts for it. But out there, they would do these shake tests like this. They also use dry ice to simulate the very cold temperatures that you get at altitude. So he worked very hard on these physical aspects. And again, I probably will overstress this a bit, but I think it can't be stressed too much, that without Parsons, without people like these enlisted guys, you really can't build atomic bombs. They're not lab activities. This is another letter here, and this, we hear about the British mission, and so we think about Tuck and Fuchs and Egan Bretcher and some folks like that, but the Brits contributed the bomb hook to the B-29 that held both Little Boy and Fat Man. And so this was a note saying, here are the hooks, and Parsons' kind of response, he's saying, oh, here's what we got to do. It's interesting, but you got to test it. It's got to be reliable. And you see the word statistical in there. This is a very Parsons approach to a great thing. But if you ask what the contribution of the British mission was to the laboratory, well, it was in physics, but it was also in bomb hooks. And so you get these, finally you start getting the shapes that you want. This is a fairly typical Little Boy. It's pretty close to the final model. But it turns out the B-29s are very low slung. And Little Boy a little bit, but Fat Man in particular were too big. You just couldn't slide them under the plane and load them up to bomb bag. You couldn't do that. So you had to build these loading pits. And he would put bombs in on a hydraulic hoist, and they would practice loading them up. So one of Parsons' big activities going into the spring of '45 was he insisted at Wendover that these pits be built and that these experiments be conducted over and over again, just loading these bombs one after another. And here you see some of the apparatus as this Little Boy model goes up into a B-29 bomb bay. And another vision of it. This is a Fat Man model here. Now, there were 4 of these loading pits built. There was 2 at Wendover, 2 on the island of Tinian in the Mariana Group where the combat missions were run. This is a 2008 photo of what's left of one of the bays there on Tinian. They keep it covered up most of the year. They keep the jungle cut back a little bit, and you can, if you go to Tinian, you can actually go and visit these. And if you know the person with the keys, they'll open a little door, and you can climb down in there. But it's like 180 degrees in there in the summer. And actually, there's one of these pits that was built at Kirtland Air Force Base. So when you take off on the runway, you actually go by it. It sits to the south, and it's about 300 years off the runway. But we kept one of these loading pits active for a short time after World War II. And so without knowing it, you've actually gone by one of these probably many times when you've flown in and out of Albuquerque. This was kind of Oppenheimer's assessment toward the end of 44 of Parsons, and you can see that he holds Parsons in high regard. Parsons was acknowledged as the unofficial number 2 at the laboratory. People really did look to them. That position becomes formalized a bit later. But again, you can see how Oppenheimer himself views Parsons and his contributions. So in summer '45, they're getting ready for the combat drop. Parsons organized what becomes Project Alberta, or more commonly known as Project A, and takes that to Tinian in the Pacific. And so this is their group photo. So here's Parsons. Norman Ramsey is right here. Raymer Schreiber, if you know him, is right here. And Harold Agnew is right there. And this is their headquarters on Tinian. And this is called the Tinian Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm not sure how you think of the atomic bomb and how it physically custody gets transferred, but it's these 3 guys who control the atomic bomb on Tinian, actually control all the operations. This man here is General Thomas Farrell. He was Grove's deputy. He actually had signature custody of the bomb. So when the bomb is released to the 509th for combat delivery, he actually signs off on the receipt that goes for that. This is Admiral Purnell. He actually represents the entire United States Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Military Use Committee. He's the guy that says it's a go, no-go mission. And this is Parsons here. He controls all the operations. And so everything that happens on Tinian is controlled and authorized by these three guys here. And it's probably little known that they're really the guys in charge. You know, it wasn't Tibbets. It wasn't LeMay, head of the 20th Air Force. They threw up impediments. They didn't like these guys there. But these are the guys that really controlled the bomb and its operation. And here's Parsons here talking to Roger Warner, one of the engineers. And this is Fred Ashworth, who was the Nagasaki weaponeer, Commander Fred Ashworth. And this is the pre-flight briefing for Hiroshima. Of course, Parsons is here, Tibbets, Norman Ramsey, I think, is sitting right there. I can't quite see. I think that's him. And there's Parsons outside that same Quonset hut. And this is what's left of the Quonset hut today. The United States Park Service owns or has a park service on Saipan, the American Memorial Park of the Pacific, honoring the fight in the Pacific and the deaths there. They're going to take over Tinian and some of these assets there. The jungle's actually being cleared back here for an anniversary celebration, but mostly you can't find it, even if you're looking hard for it. It takes a knowledgeable person. We'll cut back, but all that's left are the concrete floorings here. So it comes to late July 1945, and so the 20th Air Force sets up their bombing missions. And so this was for July 25th. This is all the bombs that are going to be dropped on Japan, except if you notice here at Niigata, there's no bombs scheduled up here. Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki, those were the primary targets for the atomic bomb. So they were off the target list and couldn't be bombed. Niigata came off pretty quickly, and so here are the three here. Kokura was for the Nagasaki mission. That was the primary. Nagasaki was the secondary. And then, of course, here's Enola Gay, and here's Little Boy being loaded into, and I mentioned the plane was low slung. You can see here's the guy here watching it, and it goes up into the bomb bay here. And so while watching this bomb being loaded, Parsons noticed that every once in a while, one of these bombers crashes on takeoff. And they held about 6,000 pounds of bombs, give or take. And so when they crashed, it was pretty dramatic. You know, the plane was destroyed, of course. A little chunk of the island might float away. People were killed. And he says, what would happen if we took off with a fully loaded Little Boy and the plane crashed? We could lose not just the plane and the crew and the little island. We'd lose everything. The island would go away, essentially. And so he decides at the last minute that Little Boy will not go off armed. It will go off unarmed. He will arm it in flight, along with a guy by the name of Morris Jepson. And so Little Boy going into the bomb bay here is an inert model. It hasn't been quite weaponized yet. And this is the actual checklist that Parsons follows in arming Little Boy. So Enola Gay takes off, and before it crosses 10,000 feet where you have to use oxygen, he cracks the bomb bay door open, crawls in, and does all these top items here. And then the last is to put in the plugs that you've seen other people talk about. Now, if they were going to abort the mission for whatever reason, he had to reverse the process. And it wasn't quite clear to anybody how he was going to reverse that process if the plane was going to crash after it was armed. They never quite thought it out. But if the plane was going to ditch at sea, he was going to have to be the last man off the plane. He was going to have to try to get as much of this accomplished as he could. So the mission, of course, goes off well. Everybody comes home. And this is what happens when they land back on Tinian. A big crowd rushes the Enola Gay. A four-star general by the name of Carl Spaatz rushes up and pins the Distinguished Service Cross on Paul Tibbets. Highest medal, highest honor given to anybody on that mission. Parsons got the Silver Star, a step or two down in importance. He gets it not from a 4-star general, but a 1-star general. He gets it not in front of cameras in the TV. He gets it in a building after the fact. And this is the first of kind of the great slights that happened to Parsons and kind of typifies his career a little bit as we get toward the end of the war. He does all of this work, he makes all of these sacrifices, and he's kind of shunted aside. He doesn't drive a plane, he doesn't drive a ship, he arms a bomb, and somehow it's not judged right. And part of this had to do with military politics. The Enola Gay mission was run by the Army. These were Army awards. This was a Navy guy. And so I believe this to be true, but it's probably not real well documented, that this was just Army politics at work. They weren't going to give a Navy guy a medal equal to Paul Tibbets. And this is kind of a summary of a transcript of Groves's talk about this. You know, this was the huge deal that the Army goes in, the Army's in charge of the project, they have this guy, and they slide him. Groves is upset, but as you can see by the note here, there's not a lot he can do about it. The compromise is reached. They will give Parsons the DSM, the Distinguished Service Medal. So again, it's below the Distinguished Service Cross. They weren't going to elevate him up to Tibbets's level, despite his contributions. And the part here about Groves said, too bad that Spots went to Nimitz instead of Farrell or Purnell. Farrell and Purnell really worked for the President of the United States through the Joint Chiefs. They had a lot of juice. They could have made this work. But instead, by going to Nimitz, Nimitz bowed to Army politics on this issue. And here I want to show you an August 14th, coincidentally, interview with Parsons and how he characterized the Nagasaki mission. Maybe. Here we go.
This is Captain William Sterling Parsons, United States Navy, of Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Captain Parsons made the original trip with the atomic bomb ship Enola Gay as weaponeer. He is in the theater as scientific head of the atomic bomb project. Captain Parsons, will you tell us briefly the story of your trip from takeoff to target?
After a photographing session that made us feel like a Hollywood premiere, we got off at about 3 o'clock in the morning in darkness and headed for Iwo Jima, which we reached about sunrise. We made certain adjustments and tests on the bomb during that flight. We then headed for the Empire, and the weather improved as we went along. We felt that it was our lucky day, and we knew it was as we made the final approach toward Hiroshima, which the navigator hit right on the button. The bombardier took over, identified the target, and everything went with perfection not approached in the rehearsals. The bomb was finally released exactly at the designated hour, and the explosion occurred as planned.
You don't get a hint of what he did or how he did it or the conditions he worked in. He totally ignored himself. So a very modest man. So Parsons comes home, and he comes home not an admiral that you might expect at the end of the war for all of his efforts, but he's promoted to Commodore. Commodore was a curious rank. It had long been abandoned by the Navy. It originally had been like a 1-star rank, like a brigadier general, but it was an obsolete rank. It had been done away with. But during World War II, the Navy resurrected the rank and gave it to people like harbor masters. They would have kind of a flag rank, but they wouldn't be real admirals. And so this was kind of the second of the insult that I think Parsons suffered during World War II, was that he didn't get promoted to admiral like he should have been Commodore. This time it's not Army politics, it's Navy politics. So in the Navy, particularly in the Pacific theater, as in Eisenhower's European theater, if you weren't part of Nimitz's team, if you didn't command an aircraft carrier or a ship, didn't spend months in combat, you couldn't be an admiral. It's plain and simple. You just couldn't be made an admiral. So Parsons becomes the last of the Commodores promoted to that rank by the United States Navy. Never complains about it, but comes back and sits on the podium here with Oppenheimer and Groves and Robert Sproul, who was president of the University of California, to receive the Army-Navy E Award. And this basically terminates his association, or direct associate for Los Alamos. He goes back and starts work at the Pentagon. So one of the first things that happens after the war is the atomic bomb is no longer a secret. The Army has it, the Navy doesn't. What are you going to do? And so even before Nagasaki, literally, General Spaatz, the four-star general who gave Tibbets his medal, is arguing that the bomb is an Air Force weapon. Navy can't touch it. It's an Air Force weapon. We've got to control it. Senator Brian McMahon from the Senate says, well, why don't we scoop up the remaining Japanese fleet and let's drop an atomic bomb on it and see what happens. And that kind of got picked up. So it fell to Parsons and Ashworth in particular to plan this operation, which became known as Operation Crossroads. But it had a bigger meaning for the Navy. In 1922, the Navy took some captured German warships and older United States ships off the Cape of Virginia, the Virginia Capes, and bombed them to see what would happen. So this is the German battleship, World War I battleship, Ostfriedland. It was war reparations that were granted to the United States. The idea was, we'll drop some bombs on it, see what happens. Well, they dropped about 60 bombs on the ship, and guess what? It's still sailing there at the bottom. Doesn't sink. A little bit of damage. You can see one of the guns a little twisted. And a couple bombs dropped alongside and started to rupture some of the steel plates. But essentially, it's still seaworthy. And so the Army gets involved. They send out some of their bombers. So Billy Mitchell, an Army general, sneaks out under the cover of darkness in early morning, drops some 2,000 bombs on this ship and sinks it, promptly flies home and says, the Army reigns triumphant over the Navy. We can sink any ship. Battleships are obsolete. This sticks in the craw of the Navy. So when the genesis of Crossroads came up, they remembered the Billy Mitchell affair. And they decided they were going to control this operation and gave it to Parsons and Ashworth to plan. So they ginned up Operation Crossroads, and they did assemble a fleet. In fact, it became the world's fourth largest fleet for a while. They sailed this into Bikini Lagoon. You see the aircraft carrier Independence up here on the left. This is the battleship Nevada here, and you'll see in a better picture it's painted orange. And it's painted orange because they're going to be the target ship. Now, the Navy can't drop the bomb. The Army still has the only planes that can carry it. But the Navy controls the ships. They said, okay, we're going to paint it orange and we're going to see what happens. And so they dropped the first bomb, which was codenamed Able. And you can see here's the brightly painted ship here a little bit. Here's what it looks like after. The Army misses the plane by about a half a mile. They can't bomb with any accuracy, but you still see the damage here. So both the Army and the Navy claim credit. This works. This is great. Let's do another one. So they detonate one underwater. And this is the result. It sinks a few more ships, but again, out of Bikini sails still the world's fourth largest fleet. Only about 12 ships are sunk. And so the Navy says, you know what, we can build ships that can withstand atomic bombs. The Army says, well, but we can bomb them. And this debate goes on and never really solved. So Parsons was the deputy task force commander for this test. He works a little bit with Los Alamos on this. And again, and I said sort of earlier that Bradbury may have been the savior of the lab. And the reason I say sort of is because Parsons pointed out when Bradbury was in the dumps at one point, he says, look, the atomic bomb is a one laboratory weapon, and that laboratory is Los Alamos. It will survive. And so I always mute this fact, and maybe Bradbury did save the laboratory, but he had some help along the way. Parsons goes on, he becomes part of the military liaison committee at the Atomic Energy Sign. He's got desk duty. He doesn't like it so much. You see, this is planning for the Sandstone operation, which he's Deputy Task Force Commander. Here's Parsons here. If you look closely, there's Darrell Froman from Los Alamos. He was the test director for this. And this was the one and only time that Parsons got crosswise with Bradbury. Parsons delved twice into physics, and both times irritated both Oppenheimer and Bradbury. So for this test, he suggested that Los Alamos design a new kind of atomic bomb, and Bradbury told him to stick to his knitting. So Parsons finally gets a sea command. This is the cruiser he gets. It's the last of the heavy gun cruisers. You can see the big guns here. He goes to sea for about a year, and then he comes back to desk duty at the Pentagon. But by this time, his career is a little bit in eclipse. The Navy really doesn't know what to do with this guy. He's obviously important to the war, He's important to atomic weapons, but he's not a battleship admiral. He's not a cruiser admiral per se. What do they do with him? So they stick him in these desk jobs. And so he bides his time in the Pentagon. But in 1953, he dies unexpectedly of a heart attack at age 52. His wife believed that the cause of the heart attack was the attack on Oppenheimer and the security hearings. Eisenhower put up a blank wall. Parsons worshipped Oppenheimer, and they were off to play golf, and he comes sick. She rushes him to Bethesda Naval Hospital. He dies 15 minutes after entering the hospital. And she, to the day she died, believed it was because of the injustice done to Oppenheimer that caused this heart attack. And so the Navy finally does a pretty decent thing. They actually name a destroyer after Parsons, the USS Parsons, and in part because of his work on the proximity fuse, in part because of Little Boy and Fat Man, in part because of the Enola Gay mission, not so much because of Bradbury, and in part because of Crossroads and Sandstone. But in 1989, the Parsons is decommissioned and sunk, and we come back to where we kind of started on this journey, with a roadside sign. And I thought it wouldn't be fair to leave it there, so I'm going to leave tonight's talk with this quote from Groves that really characterizes the career of Deak Parsons and what he meant to Los Alamos and to the nation. And with that, I'll close my talk tonight. Thank you. And I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Right, so,
Got one back here.
yes, we do, because we need to hear you on the tape. Thank you.
I just wondered if he were a smoker, because he died so young.
The question
Of
was,
a heart attack.
question was whether Parsons was a smoker. No, he was not a smoker. Probably the heart attack was due to 24-hour work days. He was a workaholic and never let up, and he was a worrier. And I think it was probably more stress than anything else that precipitated it. He didn't exercise. He wasn't, any of that sort of thing. Golf was his only sort of relaxation exercise. So no, not a smoker, but probably stress that killed him.
Roger, I was going to ask, what else did Deak do in his spare time? What was he like as a fellow?
He bought horses for his wife. The question is what he did in his spare time. He worked, basically. But he did. He was very attentive to his family. He had lost a daughter at a very young age, so he was a very doting father. He did buy horses for Martha. And one of the early implosion experiments, and I should say Parsons was not a big fan of implosion, not a big fan of Fat Man. So one day he went to Las Vegas, New Mexico to buy a horse for his wife. Charlie Critchfield and others went out on the mesa and did that first experiment I showed you with the stovepipe, because he didn't really approve of it.
The historic lore is that what he lived in the what I call the McDougal house on Bathtub Row, and the stories I'd heard was that was a bigger house than where Oppenheimer lived, and so some of the bigger parties and things for people were held at his house. Do you have anything to add, or can you embellish that?
The question was, did Parsons kind of have the bigger house, bigger than Oppenheimer's, were the better parties there? Answer is yes and yes. And to be fair, he got that because he was the ranking naval officer, technically the number 2 guy in the lab. But I'd like to point out that he really went to bat for people like Ashworth and others to get them better housing. In fact, he had one junior lieutenant whose wife was pregnant. They had adopted 2 young children. She was having some nervous breakdowns. He arranged for them to have a house in Santa Fe. He arranged for a telephone line to put down there. So he would go the extra mile for his people. So while he did have the bigger house, which went with the rank, he never forgot those people who worked for them and really worked hard on their housing as well.
What was his wife's name?
Question was, what was his wife's name? His wife's name was Martha. And she was the daughter of an admiral. And at one time, Parsons served on a ship where his father-in-law was his commanding officer. I have a question, because it hasn't been asked. Did anybody want to know where the freshwater toilet was on the Idaho? I'll entertain some guesses.
Hang over the side.
Jerry. Oh, whoever said. Guesses, where would the freshwater toilet be, and why couldn't Parsons use it? Captain's bunk, that's one. The answer is no to that one. Galley is one. That's not right.
Dispensary?
Dispensary is one. That's not right.
Was there any women's quarters?
There were no women's quarters. I will tell you where it was. It was in the brig. And the reason it's in the brig, the battleships were the only ships of size that could house a jail. And so anybody in the fleet who was in jail was sent to the battleship in these brigs. And the brig had these cages, literally, that are about this wide. You can kind of stand up. You probably can't stretch your arms out much, maybe one way. And you're lucky if you have a little cot. And so what happened early on, if you were sent to the brig, you would ask to go to the toilet. You would drink the salt water, immediately get sick, and go to the infirmary where they had white sheets, better food, and no bars. And so freshwater toilets were put in the brig. And the only people who could use them were the people in the brig. I actually paid $45 for that answer. I took a tour of the USS Missouri at Pearl Harbor one time, and this was one of the things that my tour guide told us about. So, other questions?
No other questions for Roger. Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.